All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Chris Anderson. I'm one of the PMs for Azure Functions, and kind of before that was kind of the PM for WebJobs SDK, which this kind of talk is basically how we took this thing called WebJobs SDK, which was really, it's been around for, 4 years on top of App Service, which itself is kind of this PaaS thing that's been around for a while, which is really doing, a functions-oriented compute with events for a long time, but really that last little switch for us was realizing that serverless could really help us address a lot of the customer issues that people were having. And the idea is to kind of reflect off of those lessons that we learned to kind of look to see what really serverless ends up meaning as an end customer experience, and kind of what our view as one of the vendors of serverless, how we actually kind of perceive that serverless space and what it means to customers when they start adopting serverless patterns. So, if you need to reach out to me, I've got another slide. I've got a slide at the end which has my Twitter handle on it. You can follow me. I'm constantly sending out little memes about serverless, which is kind of fun for us, but also updates on Azure Functions, the product samples, things like that. We've got our blog there as well. What I wanted to start with was, this is kind of my inspiration for this particular talk. I didn't start with this quote, but I kind of saw this quote and I realized I wanted to do that. I went looking for this quote because this isn't necessarily a person that I would know immediately all of their speeches, but it's actually by Drake. And he said this at a graduation ceremony that he was attending. And he said, sometimes it's the journey that teaches you a lot about your destination. And that's certainly true for us, because we did not start WebJobs SDK, and really a lot of the things we did to start turning WebJobs SDK into something which is doing the things it's doing today by saying, oh, we want to go build serverless. Like, that wasn't the way we started. What we ended up finding as we were going along the process, that serverless ended up delivering the customer experience that we really cared about when we started looking at the requirements that we really wanted to meet to make customers successful. So before there was Azure Functions, there was WebJobs, right? What is a web job? Because I also get all kinds of weird jokes about WebJobs in that name. But essentially, WebJobs was a way of just doing background services on top of managed compute, right? So rather than spinning up a VM or even just a simple worker role, I was able to just kind of drop this executable and run it in a continuous fashion or on demand on a scheduled basis. And it really solved a lot of needs for people who are using app service and what you might be familiar with is called as Azure websites, where essentially I needed to have some kind of background compute to go along with my web application, because best practices were that I don't have some kind of ongoing service inside of a web application. It should be taken out of that web service. Then, out of kind of like a hackathon project, responding to customer feedback about how easy it is to use Azure and Azure services in general, there was kind of this WebJobs SDK that was born that was kind of initially called Simple Batch, but WebJobs, it was designed for WebJobs, so we called it WebJobs SDK. And it really was kind of the first thing that I've seen out there that was really kind of pushing that just write a function, add a couple of attributes to it, and we'll trigger off of new events that are happening inside of blob storage or queue storage. We added service bus and all different kinds of events, and it's kind of slowly expanded and grown into a very powerful tool for the users of the Azure App Service platform, and it really forms the kind of the basic, proto elements of Azure Functions and even just serverless patterns in general. This kind of functions as a service model. That's really what WebJobs is WebJobs is functions as an SDK, right? That next leap of taking it to a service is kind of what we've kind of learned about. So how do we, get to that point? We see here that this is kind of a sample web job that we have. And if any of you guys have looked at Azure Functions, you know that Azure Functions is more than just trigger and then code. We also do these things called bindings to input and output outputs. So let's say I want to go ahead and send a queue message to, I want to send a message to a queue service at the end of my function executing, which is a very common pattern. I want to go and kick off a series of workflows and use queues to manage the elements of those workflows. It's very easy for me. You can see here, if I go and kind of hover it over it, we've got this queue trigger that I'm able to respond to different queue messages, but I also have this queue output that I'm able to assign messages to. And after my function's done executing, the underlying SDK will handle piping those messages to the right queue service for me. The nice thing is this means I don't have to bring in any SDKs which know how to talk to the queue service. I don't even need to know best practices for using queue service for the most part. That layer of abstraction is kind of taken away from me. And so in that sense, in the same way that serverless is kind of all about abstracting away the underlying compute that you're using, WebJobs got its start by trying to abstract away the services you were talking to in the first place, right? So it was really getting into that space of trying to get you to value very quickly, and really built around that very simple functions model, where we didn't want you to write giant services. We didn't want you writing very complicated things. We wanted you to write a function, triggered on the data that you want, and talking to the services you needed to, and otherwise keep your business logic quite simple. directly just business logic, as much as possible, not having service-oriented logic inside of that function. But there's so much opportunity, right? We kind of looked around, and WebJobs customers, they were more likely to be successful, right? When we went and looked at people who had used the WebJobs features and the people who used the WebJobs SDK, they were more likely to have reached production, right? That's one of the things that it's interesting as a vendor is you see a lot of people start stuff and then never finish, right? And so our goal as a vendor of cloud services is to make sure that anyone who starts something reaches production. We want you to succeed. We want you to move as quickly as possible. And we assume that if you left, maybe it was just an experiment and you planned on never finishing it, but maybe you left because you just couldn't meet the needs that you needed to. That's a failure on our part, and we want to address those things. So we found that people who were using WebJobs were succeeding, and they were using more of our resources too, which is good for us as a business because it means that we're making more money in that case. And it's a good thing for the customer because they're succeeding, and so there's a equal kind of return on value there. So there was something to this. Could we make the technology easier to adopt, though? There's some big issues that came to actually adopting the technology. First of all, the deployment model was still an application server. I'm building a console application service. I have to understand how that service runs. Then I have to understand how that service runs in the context of this managed compute. And there's a lot of friction and overhead there between writing this function which is supposed to trigger off of queues and then deploying it and managing it out there. And then, once you start talking about management, how do you scale it, right? If I've got a lot of queue messages coming across, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of queue messages, I'm not going to be able to process that off of a single worker. No matter how big the worker gets, it's just not going to make sense. So I need to scale out to new machines. Well, App Service natively has the ability to auto-scale, and much the same way that many of you guys are AWS folks, I know, so like Elastic Beanstalk, you can do auto-scaling there. App Service kind of does that even better, I would argue. But you can set up different things which look at your queue length and decide to scale it to new instances, but it's your responsibility. You have to choose the number of queues to be in your backlog before you scale out. That's decisions. Decisions are friction. It's not solving the problem of writing a function, right? So that gets in the way. And then finally, which can be a big restriction, especially since I'm a Node developer before anything else, if I can lie to myself about it at least, C# was the only language that you could use. And that's a limiting factor. On Azure, obviously, C# ends up being the first language that most people end up using, but that's not, all of our business by far. A lot of people using Azure are not using C# at all. They're using, open source kind of platforms like, Java and Node and Python and things along those lines. So how do we address them without having to re-implement our SDK in each language, which becomes an unmaintainable nightmare? Well, we kind of came up with an initial proposal, right? So the notion was to kind of build a managed WebJobs functions runtime. And the goal here was to get people able to start using functions within 5 minutes, WebJobs functions at this point, because we didn't have any fancy serverless context there, and to, within 5 minutes, finish implementing a basic form of their function, right? Get all their bindings set up correctly, do some initial communication between those things, and as long as your business logic wasn't too complex, you were able to kind of get to that point where you had value there. So our notion there was that there was some big requirements. We needed to add a language abstraction layer so we could add new languages. And so that's where you kind of see Node support coming in there. Is now we've had to add this abstraction layer where we've got this host which sends out messages to things. And we have to be able to go ahead and run and potentially even compile these different languages kind of on the fly to make sure they plug into our system. We needed to provide a very lightweight language experience for those pieces, right? If deployment and setting up CI is friction, can we just take their code as, in kind of like a scripting fashion and, compile that on the fly in the case of C#, or in the case of Node, just take a single, index.js file and run with that, without requiring a whole bunch of additional fancy steps that go along with it. And make sure that I only deploy functions. No hosts, never talking about application servers. I'm going to be focused on just my business logic inside of my functions themselves. And then we're going to help people manage their executions and scale for the developers. But that last piece is kind of the sticky thing for us, because the initial design we had was basically making it easier to set up those auto-scale rules, which means you could still potentially mess it up and get it wrong. And that was kind of a big stickler for us. And you're still talking about having to make sure instances are being utilized properly, all that kind of thing. So that's where we really kicked off to us that we've got to think about doing this better, right? App Service already has very nice built-in auto-scale, but if it involves user decisions, there's going to be problems. And problems are something we want to completely skip and avoid and get straight to the value. And each implementation ends up being different in terms of number of instances that I need, right? If I'm doing a lot of very small, fast queue processing, I can handle a lot of throughput on a single instance. If I'm doing very, very meaty media processing for every single queue message that comes in there, I'm going to need a lot of instances to handle, a lot of throughput. Explaining that thing to every customer who's just walking up and trying to use this thing, maybe they've barely ever run a service before. It's a lot of friction. The only people who were actually succeeding with this kind of thing were people who could run services, and we needed to get better at that. And so, could we do better than this? And that's really where we've kind of made this big change here of just adding this fully, right? We'll fully manage your scale and executions for you, right? And we ended up doing a rebranding of getting rid of the WebJobs because it's such a different model at that point. We didn't feel comfortable with having people who were using WebJobs assuming it was just exactly like WebJobs, even though it is very similar. And that kind of got us to the core of functions becoming serverless, right? As soon as we decided we want to fully manage everything in terms of how that scale and executions are going to work for you in this model, as far as we're concerned, fully managing executions in scale for developers is the first and most important requirement for doing serverless. If you're, to us, if you aren't covering this for folks, you're not doing it in a good fashion, you really are just kind of maybe, normal kind of managed compute, which is still great, but there's going to be friction there. And our goal with serverless is to remove as much friction as possible away from people who are just trying to get their application out the door, right? So that's kind of just an overview of how we reached that serverless notion. Like, why would functions in this WebJobs SDK itself become this managed service that's going to be serverless? It was one of those things that we kind of backed into as we were looking at this fun SDK that we really liked. We really liked the kind of functions program model. We really liked that abstraction to the different services you talked to, but we didn't like having to figure out how to host and deploy that thing. So by just focusing on the functions and using serverless as kind of our compute model, it really helped us accelerate the actual user experience that comes there. So something else that's kind of important to us, I have a pop quiz for everyone, which I'm guessing no one's going to get. Maybe Matthew can answer this appropriately. When did functions release its first preview? Anyone? Okay. Well, we actually released it in, this is a surprise to everyone on my team except for Matthew, September 23rd, because we had written this little prototype way back about a year ago of this kind of the node abstraction layer and all that kind of stuff. And Matthew started by just open sourcing the thing. And he answered a question on Stack Overflow about using Node and WebJobs together with just a link to that repository and some instructions of how to run it. And I remember at the time that you see my response, of course you'd make this public. And I said, go use Matthew's thing instead. Because I had given some answer about how to kind of redo some of the things we did inside of the SDK with your own Node implementation. And he just started out and said, hey, you know what, it's going to be open source. We're going to kind of work on it in the open and get a lot of feedback as we're going along there. So that kind of introduces me to the next part of this in terms of making of Azure Functions. The fact that we're kind of really driven on having this open source and being able to work with people very directly as we're doing our development process, and that we're very community focused, it really drives a lot of how we make decisions and how we actually make our product go, right? It's really empowering to us to have so many people be able to play in our system and help us make our decisions for us, really, right? If people are telling us what to go build, we're that much closer at building something which people are going to go use. So we really love the open source. We're MIT licensed under the .NET Foundation, so it's really easy to sign up for the single CLA thing that the .NET Foundation has, and then you can commit to any of the different repositories that are there. And currently we've got about 6 different repositories and different kind of projects inside of there. You've got the actual core of the underlying eventing stuff that we've got called WebJobs Core. The various triggers and bindings that we have are generally inside of the extensions place. And then we have the functions host, which is the thing which is actually running your functions and dynamically pulling in your JavaScript and C# and Python stuff to actually go run it. And then we've got all of our templates that you see inside of our portal, the portal code itself, which has an interesting story I'll share with you guys, and our docs are all kind of open source out there ready for people to kind of peruse and poke at and tell us why we did something stupid, potentially, or smart, but probably you're yelling at us because we thought we did something stupid, which is fine. Because really we're ultimately open source for selfish reasons. We didn't start this because there was some kind of requirement inside of Microsoft to go do open source. We're growing inside of open source instead of Microsoft, not because it's some kind of mandate from up top, but because the people who are our bosses aren't stopping us from open sourcing things. It's just a thing that we want to do as developers and organizations. And so really this had just big advantages for us. It's easier to work with the latest tools and services with CI integration, stuff like that. We don't have to be limited to whatever we're running in the background privately. It was easier to work and communicate with customers, right? Because we had this thing open sourced way back before we were thinking about doing it as even a fully serverless thing, which really kind of started at the very beginning of this year. we were able to start working with people in a very iterative fashion. We had people who were giving us feedback even that weren't fully under NDA of Microsoft, things along those lines that are kind of in the gray area of what I'm sure Microsoft marketing and legal would like me to be doing. I'm able to play in that space because we're open source and I can kind of just always be transparent as much as possible. And I was able to accept and work with other teams inside of Microsoft much easier. Normally working with other teams inside of our giant company, there's just way too many teams and all that kind of stuff. It can be hard to actually like take code from one part of the company and accept it inside of your own repository and work with it and maintain it. But because we kind of just worked with the external teams the same way we would work with like a regular person from the community, there was a whole lot less friction. There was a whole lot less kind of like political games that might happen inside of a large enterprise like that. It was just developers, sharing code via pull requests, giving good code review and feedback via that kind of pull request model. So we just treated the other teams instead of Microsoft like any other user or customer of Azure Functions. And like I said, the transparency, it's really freeing for me. As a product manager, I've worked on things that are like a security, and I can't talk about things for like 6 months. I have to make sure everyone signs off on the right things before I start my meeting. And it's friction, and I hate it, honestly. So the fact that with Functions, people can ask me about this feature, or why we did this, or are you guys going to build this, or what's coming up in the next few months, I can just be like transparently, look at all the stuff on our GitHub. We have all of our issues, all of our pull requests, all that stuff is tracked there. So you can kind of see where we did, pull requests for big features and go look at why we did that. You can go see where we rejected issues because we didn't see it was relevant to us. You can provide your loud, very opinionated feedback for why we should have done this instead of this. We're open to it, we respond, and we're very active on there. And all of our team communication, we try to drive through GitHub as well, so you can kind of see internally what we're talking about, what we're concerned with. And really, I love this as a product manager because often I get questions of like, why does this work this way? And for most of the time, I try to explain it to you in ways that you understand, but it's really nice to be able to just point to the source code and say, hey, you can see this implementation works like this. That's the reason it works like this crazy thing. And when people want to start doing things which aren't necessarily in our boundaries of normal, I can say, well, that might work. I'm not sure. We haven't tried to support that, but you can go look to see how we've implemented this, and it might end up fitting your scenario. Maybe you have to send us a pull request to kind of tweak it slightly, but might work if you can kind of poke at it. That's a really nice experience for me to have because it means that I don't have to be like no or I don't know. I can kind of be like, I don't know, and we can go walk through the source code together and see if I can find the answer for them. So really, Azure Functions wouldn't have been as quick to develop or featureful if it hadn't been for open source. Like full stop, that's really important to kind of the history of how we built the thing, and it informs a lot of the decisions and things that you see us behave when you go look at the history of the features we have built. And it's great for you as customers, right? I heard someone complaining at the end of the last talk maybe about like having a hard time communicating with folks. It's really important to us to talk with the people who are using our service, and it's really easy to submit a feature. It's really, it's not as easy to send us a PR, but we've taken community pull requests and things like that. We have really high quality standards, and our engineering docs aren't always the greatest, so you can kind of have some friction there, but we're going to be investing in making that stuff smoother. But as far as like raising a feature request, you just put it on GitHub. We do triage, 3 times a week, more or less. And I might put you on the backlog, and you might not like being on the backlog, but you have full transparency that that was the decision we made. And when we go through there and go through our planning cycle and pick it up off the backlog, you know that, hey, now we're working on this thing. You can start contributing feedback with how you'd like to see the feature built. You can see their pull request, implemented your feature, and go look to see, oh, that's kind of wrong. Could you guys tweak this? And we are very open to that kind of feedback. So to us, that's really important as we're building this thing out. We don't want this to be, our version of serverless as much as it is kind of our version of serverless. We want it to be, our version of serverless, everyone here in this room's version of serverless, because we really do like getting that smart feedback from the folks that are using it day to day. So one success story of this particular kind of open model ended up being F#. We've got a research team based here in Cambridge, actually, that's been doing F#, really smart guys like Dom Simon and all of them. And they wanted to add F# to functions. Functions is actually a great use case for F#, right? It's a functional F#. It really fit a lot of the patterns that we like to kind of evangelize in the first place well, because F# is all about trying not to have state and things like that as well. So instead of having them like explain to us how we'd implement it or having them like work with us a bunch behind the scenes and all that kind of stuff, we just had them send us PRs, and we did all of our feedback open on the open via those PRs. And it was a real success story for us in terms of they had like a busy month, and so they stopped working on the PR, and like, okay, cool, we're gonna keep on working on our own things, and then came back and finished their PR, and we helped get it in, and then boom, everyone was ready to use it. And all the F# community members could see that they were working on it, and they were able to go ahead and ping them and say, hey, this doesn't look right, or oh, I'd prefer this API to look like this, right? The fact that not only were we having internal Microsoft teams kind of work in that kind of more loose fashion, but also having the community members that cared about that feature, seeing the way they were interacting and providing feedback as we were doing that process was one of the coolest things I've seen at Microsoft and big companies in general. Just that was a very natural way of working, and it really means that we can move very quickly. One other really cool scenario in terms of how open source has really been able to improve us is a more customer-facing side of things. So Plexure is actually a digital marketing service that actually has a really cool way of you can send IoT and customer data through their pipeline, and then you can create a little workflow which says every single time that I have my customer walk into this geo-fenced area, run these sets of workflow, send them a text message, go ahead and put something into a database, et cetera, et cetera. And they really wanted to kind of do custom code extensibility, and so they were looking at being able to support webhooks, right? Just calling out to other services. Well, one of the best ways of doing webhooks for serverless, for anyone who's been doing this stuff, is obviously serverless, right? Almost every single serverless application out there, regardless of what the implementation is, it's kick-ass for webhooks, right? So they were already keen on Azure. They were looking to see how could we actually do this Azure Functions to Plexure integration better. Well, they're a bunch of smart people, and they actually noticed that our portal code was open source. So they just took all of our Angular 2 components that we had and reused it inside of their own UX and hooked up our kind of components to their own subscriptions, their own managed functions. And they've built their own kind of Azure Functions as a service thing for their customers. So now rather than telling their customers, go create an Azure account, go create a function, set up this webhook, give us this URL, make sure that you secure it and rotate the API key, they're just write code in our portal. And it's great because now they don't have to we use AWS or we use Google. I want to use Azure Functions. They've just got that direct thing ready to go, and there's no kind of friction that comes with starting to do those custom extensibility things. And they are also writing all of their underlying integrations now with functions, and they can start doing a lot of reusability that comes along there. And that's all possible because we open sourced our implementation of our portal, right? If we had just kept that closed source because no one's gonna ever actually want to bother with our portal or anything like that, that would have never happened. And now it's transformational for their business to be able to provide that kind of custom extensibility. And it's been a really cool journey for us to see someone else try to reuse our portal code somewhere else where we didn't design it to be reused by anyone else by us, and seeing the kinds of things that they did with that. So it's really something that would have only happened if we did kind of embrace this fully open source, fully transparent kind of model of working. So kind of the last category of things that we're thinking about, and some of this stuff we thought about earlier on, and some of these things we're still kind of fully grokking and accepting. We went around and we spent a lot of time talking to people who are doing serverless on all platforms, all people who are struggling, all people who are succeeding, all that kind of stuff, and we try to get a lot of feedback. And really what we notice is there's still just a lack of consistent DevOps story around serverless. There's so many talks here at this own conference about how to do DevOps right on serverless. And every single talk that I've seen has been slightly different from the last one. So clearly this is not a solved space. There's whole vendors and companies and startups here that are based around providing some of these DevOps features to serverless platform vendors, right? That screams that there's a big problem and a big demand to solve that problem. So I kind of broke it down into these three big categories. Local, your normal dev tooling, right? As soon as you started removing application servers, all the tooling went out the window because all the tooling out there is for building application servers and debugging application servers. It's not for this cloud-based scripting stuff. Deployment also ends up being funny. A lot of the cases, these are functions as a service models. And so you're deploying individual functions as your management unit, and none of the continuous integration things out there that generally were focused around deploying web servers and application servers understood that at all, and definitely didn't know the actual deployment. They could do builds if they really wanted to trick them into doing builds, but they really didn't know about that deployment step. That last piece there was just not very easy. And then monitoring. Most of the monitoring stuff out there is really about monitoring, application servers. A lot of the tools out there like New Relic or Application Insights for Azure is go in and attach some stuff to your application server, in IIS or Apache, and it'll automatically log all the requests that come through the pipeline for you automatically. You don't even need to write any code inside of your application server at that point. We'll hook in automatically. Well, there's nothing like that, really working with these serverless platforms because, frankly, a lot of them are still kind of closed source, so it's hard for people to hook into them. But even us, where we're open source, we haven't built an extensibility point where people can plug those things into it yet. When we first designed it, we focused on functions, not the other custom integrations people might want to offer. So these are real big things that we kind of wanted to start closing, even after we'd kind of come up with our decision of going to serverless. This is us reflecting on what's going wrong in serverless and trying to think about how can we potentially address it. So we also looked at what came out of the box. Azure Functions itself was built on top of this app service platform that Azure has. That's been around for 5 years. There's some hundreds of thousands of applications on there. Very well used, very popular, but it's all about building application servers. It's all about deploying application servers onto it. So we had some things that worked out of the box, but some things didn't work necessarily as straightforward as we thought they did. We assumed that tooling like Visual Studio and CLI would just continue to work the way that it was working for app service like normal. It wasn't. Visual Studio didn't understand functions really at all. Monitoring, application insights, Azure Insights, they were once again very server focused. So how do we make this work for functions? And deployment, CI/CD integration with VSTS, that actually worked fairly well because we ended up keeping, we didn't do a per function as a management unit. We ended up doing kind of a function app, a function container, a collection of functions as a deployment unit. And that ended up making a lot of the CI/CD stuff a lot more manageable because it was a bit more like deploying just a regular website. It was a collection of code that did a series of things. It's a bit like kind of deploying a microservice where you've got this kind of deployment unit of common logic that you're deploying together. So that was better, but still, there was no first-class things there. VSTS didn't know what a function app was, so you were just kind of creating like a little website and pretending like it was a function app, lying to yourself for the most part. So that's kind of really the long and the short of it is that we really had to then think about, okay, well, deployment's kind of working for us. Monitoring kind of works because we have this existing thing that came from WebJobs with the WebJobs dashboard. And we really have no tooling story. Like we're in the same boat as everyone else out there. There's just no tooling story out there that just works for a platform out of the box. So of course the first thing we did was ignore those problems and create a web portal because this seems to be just the ground entry standard experience. And it made a lot of sense because our initial goal, if you remember, was that 5x5 experience. We wanted people to get started in 5 seconds and we wanted them to go ahead and be finished with their first particular adoption scenario in 5 minutes. If they had to install tools, that would have taken up that full 5 minutes. They wouldn't be able to get started in 5 seconds. So doing the portal experience really makes a lot of sense for us to meet that metric of getting people into the system quickly and solving problems and learning the value of serverless really was what it is, because so much of what we're still doing as vendors today is education. Most people aren't you guys learning about serverless coming to conferences. They're discovering it via calls and blogs and videos, and it's still a very organic kind of process of trying to reach as many people about this as possible. So having it easy to adopt in the early stages is still very important for all of us. And we're looking, of course, to add more features like IntelliSense and better release management there. So it's not like we're going to say that, okay, eventually you're going to reach a certain point in the portal and you're going to want to navigate away. A lot of people are going to want to, we've seen. Like that's just what the evidence shows. But we definitely want to continue to invest in there to see if we can make people successful longer without having to jump out to your more standard tooling story. But how do we address tooling for real, though, right? No matter what we do inside of the portal, you're always going to want to use your own tools, more or less. You're used to a lot of these patterns, especially if you're trying to convince enterprises that have been doing things the same way for years to start using serverless, because there's a lot of value for enterprises with serverless, right? The cost management stuff there is easy. The technological skill required to do something relatively straightforward there is a little bit lower than just building an application server. A lot of good advantages there. So one of the things we realized was that a lot of the tooling broke because we removed the server in the first place. That's what the tools knew how to go and debug, was some kind of server somewhere. Application server in this case, not necessarily the hardware server itself. But the interesting thing for us is because we have this functions host and we open sourced it already, so it's not like we're worried about it floating out into the wild and someone running their own service using our functions host because we're open source. They could do that anyway. We could actually just create an NPM package that would let you install a local version of the host. And so that's exactly what we're going to end up covering in our lightning talk tomorrow about DevOps. So I'm not going to go too deeply into like a demo of how that works here. But essentially, now you can actually take that local host and run it. It's Windows only because we're on 4.6. We have to move to .NET Core. It'll happen as soon as I possibly can get that working. But you can run that thing on Windows today. Install functions, do func new, func run my function -- debug, and we'll actually hook up a debugger so you can walk through your function. And you can literally step through your function like you normally would have if you had an Express application or a web API, right? And that to us, when we first saw, this came kind of out of a hackathon project initially, just internally in our team, and then we're like, oh, that's amazing. We're going to go and make sure that that is part of our, really final story is having that local host. I think it really helps to address a lot of that early tooling problems of working locally, where I'm not having to use unit testing as my only means of doing local testing and debugging, right? Because you're always going to run into an issue where when you get an event from the actual service itself, it looks differently than your unit test did. Your unit test was slightly different in how that data was behaving. And so you don't really catch those things until you're running in a more production-like environment locally. And that actually happened to me as I was preparing my App Insights demo that you guys will see tomorrow, where I was missing like an instrumentation key somewhere, and I was trying to log and printf everywhere, trying to figure it out. And then I remembered that I could debug, because it's still kind of clicking in my head that I can do that model. I've been doing, printf debugging for, months now, along with the rest of you. And I remembered, I can just set a breakpoint here, and I just realized, that instrumentation key isn't showing up. That's the reason none of my data is flowing. It's because it doesn't know where to go in the first place. So, here's just a quick screenshot to show that I'm not entirely BSing. It's right there. Well, as I said, we'll go into full detail of that tomorrow and kind of a nice kind of blitz lightning talk on this subject. So what does kind of monitoring mean? So WebJobs already had this notion of being able to kind of look at all your past executions and kind of see them in a nice, web view. We had all of your console logs there. We had all of your inputs that came into your function and any outputs you had, and successes, failures, duration of execution. All that metadata is there. And so we just kind of decided to reuse it. But I think one of the big things that we're learning now, and this is something that we're kind of still in the process of fixing even, so more than just the making of Azure functions, this is also the current making of Azure functions, both past and present. We realize that App Insights and these kind of more deeper monitoring and alerting tools are really going to be important to our platform. So we're now looking at baking these kinds of experiences deeper into our platform. So we're going to probably start with App Insights, but we're going to be open to working with the various monitoring vendors that have kind of popped out of the rest of the serverless space, working with other more classical web server-based monitoring tools, and just really trying to make it easy to kind of bring which tool you want to do monitoring, because compute and monitoring are two different problems. And we want you to be able to kind of, as much as possible, reuse your existing monitoring tools and your services there. And we've also got great things to, one big problem that I kind of want to help get people over the hump of before it really becomes a huge issue is that if a lot of monitoring is kind of per function based, like a lot of our logging is today with the existing WebJobs dashboard thing, how do you monitor a function, a collection of functions, maybe on a single app in our case, or maybe I have like a bunch of different microservices inside of my system that I need to manage and maintain. You can't just keep monitoring at that level. You have to provide a way of kind of providing an aggregated health of your service. If you really want to do that kind of true DevOps, have alerting going on in that life cycle, you need that capability. And oftentimes you're having to go and like pull in some kind of log analytics tool or something like that to go pull over your logs to make that work. It's got to just plug and play in order for people to really be successful in doing this longer term. And as we see more people adopting serverless, we're going to see more people who aren't willing to put the sweat equity into making a thing work, which it's every single talk that I have peeked in here, I always end up finding some part of the talk where like, by the way, not everything's perfect yet. And the fact that we still have to kind of talk about that, even though we're here all drinking the Kool-Aid, is probably a sign that we really have a lot more investment to make this stuff smooth. And so you'll see us doing a lot more of this investment now. Right now we have a cool demo of basically just bring your own App Insights. You have to drop some libraries in the right place. And soon it'll be baked into our platform, we think. And so you get really cool experiences like what we see here on this dashboard, where I can kind of see my graph executions. It can be hard to read in the size that it is, but we'll see it show up bigger tomorrow. I actually have a very rich query language that I can write. So if I have a specific query I want to look for, like a customer had a problem, and I can track that problem to an operational ID that we gave them in the failed request, I can go look at the operational ID via this query window we have, and go look up all the different operations that happened there, and figure out what failed along the way, what caused that failure. Like that kind of in-depth, insight into what's going on into my application as a whole, not just my function, but my application, right? Because when I'm writing a collection of functions, it's still an application in the end. We need to be able to provide that kind of insight as a platform. So for the most part, that covers everything I wanted to do, just kind of pitch for functions in general. I'm sure you saw this with Yohai's great talk. Definitely try functions at azure.com if you haven't done it already. We're doing some really cool things, like I said, with the tooling, or our bindings model itself is really interesting in relation to a lot of the other services out there, so it's definitely worth giving a try just to try out the different flavors out there. And if any of you guys have any questions, I'm open for questions. You can either ask them to me here, or they might kick me off so we can start the lightning talks. But you can also reach out to me on Twitter. I'm too active there, so it can be fun to annoy me on there with different questions. But also always reach me at my email if you have something that you don't want to put on public Twitter.
We've got about one or 2 minutes for talks.
Okay.
Questions.
Cool, yeah, so 1 or 2 minutes, anyone?